welcome to another episode of What About Design? This is your host, Maria Cernat, as usual, and with me, as usual, Frank Myonk. Thanks for
Hello.
being here with us. So
Always a
today
pleasure.
it is another chapter in the very interesting history of graphic design. And we are going to start our journey by discussing a very interesting designer that is called Herbert Bayer. Now, it is a very interesting period. We are discussing here about what happened in the interwar period, the Second World War, and the few years after. And then we are going to discuss the mid-century modern, what happens in the 50s in the history of design. Now, Herbert Bayer was an Austrian and American graphic designer, painter, photographer, and interior designer and architect. He was very talented. He started designing in Germany, and there he had a very prolific career, but unfortunately, he had to flee at some point. He worked for important magazines like Die Neue Linie. I often show this design to my students, Frank, because you see how nice it is. And if you were to see something like this today, you would have probably find it difficult to believe that it was actually created such a
38.
long time ago in 1938, isn't it?
It looks very temporary, of course. Very, fresh.
Very fresh, very new. He had very interesting ideas. And one of those ideas was to give up the Gothic characters, the German ones that were used, and to use these sans serif fonts that were considered modern and a part of a possible universal visual vocabulary that modernist artists believed in. Now, you would have thought that such a choice of fonts would have been also considered a political declaration, but actually it was. Now, he worked even after the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, but unfortunately he was first to flee Nazi Germany because in 1937, I think he was already summoned to some sort of he was investigated, and the very thing that convinced him to flee Nazi Germany was the fact that in 1937, Nazis organized an exhibition with what they called degenerate art. And they included, unfortunately, the works of Herbert Bayer among the works that were considered degenerate. So he had to go because now he was an outcast and he was considered somebody not deemed of, respect in his own country. And it was quite dangerous, to say the truth, because while, for instance, in Italy, you remember we had this very close friendship between Marinetti, who wrote the futurist manifesto, but also the fascist manifesto, and was in a very good relation with Mussolini. And this particular current of modernism was vividly encouraged by the political power in Italy. That was not the case in Germany. In Germany, the Nazis considered even these fonts, they consider this choice of fonts as some sort of departure from the national character of the true and authentic German design. So they basically consider this to be un-German, so to speak, and unpatriotic and degenerate and so on and so forth. So you see how designers and artists in general were considered either to be encouraged if they were close to the political power, or if not, they were to be cast away and marginalized. Now, the problem here is that you see the Nazis considered the Bauhaus related to the Weimar Republic, that was the name of Germany between 1919 and 1933, when actually Hitler came to power. Now, the problem is it was considered related to Bolshevism, and it was considered un-German, and it was somehow cast away. Now, I have a question for you, but you go first.
Was he gay or Jewish, or neither of them?
I think he was
Because
Jewish
as we
because,
know,
yes,
the Nazis were against that, and they considered everything that was made by Jews or gay people, or I don't know, gypsy, or people who are, was considered to be non-patriotic or against the, the system or stuff like that.
well,
And
he
they were
was very
actually,
close. Well, let me tell you that this was a special case because he was very close to Bauhaus, and they were not against only those who were, gay or Jews. Of course, that was the first wave, that was the first wave of, so to say, marginalizing designers. But the second one was directed and targeted against those who were close to the Bauhaus movement, So in the first wave, when you were Jew, you had to flee right away because the danger was that you'd have been sent to some sort of concentration camp or discriminated against just for being Jew. But then again, for in this case, he was repudiated and expelled, from the artistic movement because he was close to the Bauhaus school. And for him, we have a saying in Romanian, that every kick you get, that means you move forward 3 steps, or it's
get you
some sort
stronger.
of help in advancing, and that was the case for him. In 1944, he married Joella Sinara, and she was a poet in the Dada movement. The same year, he became a US citizen. And he was basically hired by an industrial visionary, Walter Pipcake, and he moved to Aspen, Colorado. And there he was able to co-design and, you know, he co-designed Aspen Institute. He restored Opera House. So he was very prolific and very much appreciated. Now, the history also mentions a very interesting thing related to his personal relation to another visionary old man this time, that was Robert Anderson. And when Anderson saw this ultra modern Bauhaus inspired home where Bayer lived, he basically designed it and built it in Aspen. He went to the front door and introduced himself and said, "Look, I love your house and I would love something like this. I would love you to come and work for me." And that was the beginning of a very fruitful relation. And basically, he was hired to design a number of things, from monuments to houses to all sorts of things that were contributing to his success on American soil, starting from 1944. So basically, he was in some way advantaged, so to speak, by this type of treatment that he got in his native Germany. As I told you, another thing, he was very much related to companies that were also very prone to invest in art, and that was also the case of a very large packaging company that is called Container Corporation of America, that used to invest in nonprofits and basically in art. They invested in Colorado Institute of Humanities, and he was hired to do the design for the World Geographic Atlas in 1953. But this is only one of the many designs that he created in the USA. He was appreciated, and his legacy still stands. Now, moving on what I would like to ask you, see, because my students often ask me, what is creativity? And I always say, look, it doesn't, it is not enough to be talented, as we saw in these cases. You have to find a particular context, historical, political, financial, in order to be able to leave your mark in the history of design. And I think you would agree, isn't it?
Of course, yes. I would say is this is the ability of a person that is, enlightened in the ways of design and also enlightened in ways of art history, because it's very important to combine, one with another. And also, I think it's very important to have a knowledge about the archetypes and stuff, and of course composition. And I think this is the way of creativity is to choose the correct solution for the exact problem. So, for example, if you want to advertise, I don't know, toilet seats, you need to create something that is not offensive for the people, and at the same time to show the benefits of this tools, because this is a tool actually for our everyday life. And of course, you can show the environment of this product so that you can show us that from one side it's very usable, that this is something that we need in everyday life, and from the other side that this is something that is that it's something that we need, something that is needed. But if you want to, of course, be remembered as an artist in the everyday life, you have to find something that is not that was not perceived by others, something else, something different, something unique,
Something
which is
original.
extremely hard by those days, because we have a lot of information and a lot of already done
Experiments and
solutions.
ideas. Mm-hmm.
Solutions, yes, and a lot of experts actually. But of course, if you believe in this, what you're doing, so I think you will find solution for everything.
Now, moving on to our next interesting designer. Here is a very interesting personality in graphic design. He is known worldwide, but why do I say that he is unique in his kind? Because as we remember from discussing Marinetti, he wanted to create a revolution in designing book covers and book jackets and all sorts of things, saying, I am creating a revolution in typography. If I want, I will use 20 fonts and 20 colors on my page, and I will give up this very classic way of designing book covers. Now, what we are seeing here actually is a book cover from the 500 actually that he overseed when he was hired by Penguin Books. And what do we see here is some sort of return to the classical design of book covers with this frame and with this type of aesthetic and of this type of elements here on the book cover. But at the same time, a very, clear and
Okay.
very simple design. So he basically combined the two, the modernist ideas of having functional and very simple designs with a return to the classical design. And he was strongly influenced by Bauhaus and social constructivism, but this type of return to the classical tradition is why we discuss about Jan Tschicholder's the neoclassical designer that brought back some of the classical elements and combined them with the modern ones. And he also created a font that you can download, and it is free, the Sabon. So most of the designers created a lot of fonts. He is especially known for this one that has the variations that I listed here. Now, moving on. We have here a very interesting and at the same time a very sad story in a way of Kurt Schwitters. Kurt Schwitters was the founder of the Ring. You see here that this is some sort of, they are somehow announcing what was to be the Grafus collective in France, the idea that they should join and collectively sign works and through their cooperation create designs that were not assumed by a single person. So he founded this organization of professional designers, mimicking the idea of a radical group of architects that used the same name. So the idea was to publish works together. A very interesting, especially, don't you think so, Frank, especially in our super individualistic society, to have this perspective where every artist wants to be known for herself, for himself, to create a name and to become, the hero of creativity in design, to have this type of perspective. What do you think? Would you like to be part of that, such a collective?
Well, yes and no. First of all, I'm not only a designer, I'm overall artist. I do other stuff. I do films, I do music, I'm something. I'm not only, I don't perceive myself only as a designer, as a person who creates images. So that gives me more, wide perspective of everything, of the world, that surrounds us, of the artistic world that surrounds us. Of course, I think, this what I do. In my case, I cannot say about the others, is because I love it, you know, because I love to do this, and that gives me a unique, happiness. I feel, useful. And I don't. If somebody, of course, is will say that, oh, your stuff is great. I like your stuff. That is good, but I'm not a person, especially me in my case, that wants to, to dominate overall. But of course, there is this balance between how well will you advertise your stuff, your work, and how well will you be recognized by others. So this is the very thin line. I think for them in the in the time before war was a bit easier because they were pioneers in this what they were doing. And right now we are not pioneers. We are actually stepping on the shoes,
On the
on the
footprints
steps,
created
on
by
the foot.
others.
Exactly, yes, on the footprints of others who are before us. So for us, it's much more difficult than for them. But anyways, it's fun stuff.
Well, Kurt Schwitters had everything going for him. Why? Because his father had a ladies' clothes shop, and the business was sold in 1898. So the family wisely used all the money to buy in Hanover a lot of buildings, properties, and they rented those out. And that allowed the family to live on the income. And basically, that allowed him to live from this for the rest of his life. So, very smart move. Um, unfortunately, his health was not exceptional. So he suffered from epileptic seizures from time to time, and he was exempt from military service in World War I. And basically, he was able to follow his dream of becoming a designer, which he did. He was a very prolific one. And he worked in Hanover for a lot of time. He was also a member of the Dadaist movement. He was close to that. And what is also interesting to note was that basically, along with other friends, he recreated the design of some of the buildings, actually 6 of the rooms of the buildings that he owned. So he recreated it in a very interesting architectural design. Now, as in the case of other designers, he had to flee Nazi Germany. And at the beginning of the Second World War, he fled first not to England, but he had to flee to Norway, and he stood there for a while because it was not possible for him to stay since all the art that they created that was not so-called German or obeying the German characteristics was deemed degenerate art. So basically, in 1937, Schwitters was, summoned for an interview with the Gestapo. So he fled to Norway to join his son Ernst, who was already there. Now, his wife had to stay back in Germany to take care of the properties and to collect the rents in order for the family to be able to survive. And unfortunately, the last time that they were able to see each other was 1939, where she visited him in Norway. And then she would die in 1944, and he died in 1948. A very tragic story that was continued in the same, sad way for Kurt Schwitters, because from Norway he had to flee to England, and he arrived in 1940 to Hutchinson camp. That was a camp for refugees. And there, what is interesting, it was that he was a very he had teacher's skills, and he taught students how to produce art. He took students there. They had no materials, and the history says that they created into a room that smelled awful because they would use the most, original materials such as fish oil or all sorts of things to get paintings and material. So he was able to produce like 200 works during his internment in that refugee camp. He was able to leave that only in 1941, and he wanted to organize in England an exhibition, but it was not very well received. He was only able to sell one of his arts there. So the salvation came from the Museum of Modern Art in New York. That was an institution that played a huge role in the advancement and, protection of modernist artists and modern art. They gave him 1,000 pounds, I think. I hope I'm not mistaken. And after the war, he tried desperately to rebuild some of the rooms he created and were destroyed during the war. And unfortunately, because he was not enjoying a very good health, he died in 1948. So what we see here is a rather sad, you know, rather sad destiny of somebody who was very much marginalized by political leaders and for no reason. I mean, can you see how absurd things might get? I mean, you had basically the same kinds of ideas and techniques being used because there are a lot of resemblances between the Italian futurism and this time of modernist vocabulary that the Bauhaus used, the idea of bringing art closer to the public, of having functional design, universal visual language, but you had, two different relations with the political factor that moved designers into completely opposite, camps,
Direction. Mhm.
completely opposite directions. So yeah, that was his story. Now, at the same time, it is interesting that designers started more and more to experiment with photo montage. It is very interesting that these memes that we have today were started actually with very rudimentary and primitive techniques in 1830, and various artists used them, but among them, a female that was almost unique in the German Dadaist movement, that's Hannah Höch, is a very well-known artist that was not only the only female, but she was also a feminist. And usually this type of art was used in the Dadaist movement in order to denounce political and social themes such as inequality, the effects of war, or feminism. Now we are reaching to a very interesting part that is related, as I told you, to the only, almost unique woman in German Dadaism. They were progressives, but unfortunately, many of the progressive movements in the history of art or in the political history that we had in the past century privileged only men, and unfortunately that was also her case. She was very much concentrated on feminist issues, on the idea or on how to deconstruct actually gender roles, very very progressive and forward thinking for her time. And she also had this idea of deconstructing the idea of the new woman. Now, the idea of the new woman was a feminist political ideal based on the fact that women should advance in their careers and become more independent. It was also related to the suffragette movement, and she was very much interested into how do you create this gender, stereotypes and expectations. And he used the photo montages where he used male and female bodies only to, have this perspective and on how fluid basically this type of gender expectations actually are. And he criticized she was in a relation with Raoul Hausmann, who was a prominent figure of the Dadaist movement in Germany. Unfortunately, he was married, and even though they had a very passionate relation, he would not leave his wife. He despised her, and he called her name. He was kind of derogatory, and it was not only him that said that her contribution to the Dadaist movement was basically cooking for them and bringing them food. So they were rather cruel to her, and she fought back. Actually, she wrote, what is very interesting is that she wrote a short story, The Painter, about an artist that who finds himself thrown into a deep spiritual crisis when his wife asks him to wash the dishes, basically. So she was very much, she was not somebody to be tamed. And she came back, actually. She lived, during the war, she lived in a quiet house near Berlin, and she was, keeping a low profile. Of course, she suffered a lot because her work was not being shown, considered degenerate as the other artists' works were also considered that were related to the Bauhaus and modernist movement. But then in Eastern, after World War II, she was able to have exhibition, and she came back after 1960 to the theme of feminism, of gender, and all this. I want to ask you, how is the situation right now? How many female designers do you know right now?
Oh, I think it's equal. I mean,
It's equal.
in my case, I mean, due my observations, I think the same amount of female designers are, involved with the process of, design, but the executive functions are still, I think, men dominated. Just as an observation, that when she fought, when she wrote this article, at the same time, Maria Skłodowska-Curie, was involved with the, she was working with her husband, actually, Pierre Curie. Maria Curie was the one that
Yes. They won the first
discovered the
Nobel.
rod.
They actually
Yeah,
won 2 prizes. Yes, I know.
yes.
Well, it was a good
And
time, but
of course the background of the of women equality was rising then in the USSR, which is a new country, and I think
yes,
the
yes.
emancipation of women, well, this is the historical background, which I
Mhm.
think is also important, because they react to this, that they hear that what happened in other countries. So I think everything is connected, just to
Yes, of
have a
course,
full
she was
picture.
not unique in her own field. But you know what is said, that art should be very progressive. But you think that, you see, in science, once you discover something, even though the first prize, was almost taken away for Marie Curie, the second one, they couldn't, get around with it because it was a discovery, it was hers. So it was kind of difficult to do it, even though there were, cases where women first discovered important things, and then there were men who claimed, the glory. But it was rather more difficult. But here you see in art, because there is no clear cut, there is no clear, how to say, evaluation and objective, measurement of assessment of your achievements, then it is very easy to get smeared and to get pushed aside. And this is why you need this type of fresh look at the history of design. When you put the forefront and you investigate also, like we have this book, Women in the Metropolis, Gender and Modernity in the Weimar Culture. It is a very interesting book that focuses mainly on female artists during that time. Now, moving on, Helmut Herzfeld that took the name John Heartfield when in Germany, because he was, I think, from all the designers that I read so far and I presented so far, he was a rebel. I mean, when he saw that the Germans were, smearing Great Britain, and that was a very, you know, an important sentiment against England. They had even a saying, God punish Great Britain in Germany. He took, this name, John Harfield. So he said, from now on, I'm going to take a British name for myself. Now, his
It's
story
a
is
translation of the German one, the exact translation of the German. And
exactly, but
fun
he
fact,
did it, to upset the
yeah,
authorities and society.
I just want to say one fact, fun fact, okay? Actually, the name of the royal family in England, this Prince Philip's last name is Mountbatten, right? Or Mountbatten, which is the exact translation of the German Battenberg. So,
Interesting. So now, John Hartfield was born in June 1891. His father was a socialist writer and his mother was a textile worker and political activist. So you would have thought that he had everything going for himself because he had such educated and politically involved parents. Now, let me tell you that in 1899, when he was just 8, he and his sisters were abandoned in the woods by his parents. So the 4 children had to live with a priest, Protestant priest in Aigen, that is near Salzburg. He tried to keep them together, but he was a rebel. The story goes, and he has a nephew that gives lectures about him, and on the side that this nephew created for John Hartfield, there is this very touching story about his parent going into the woods, and for 4 days he wouldn't leave because he was searching for his mother. Can you believe that? So it
cool.
is it's horrible. And basically this priest tried to keep the family together, but he was not able, and especially because John Hartfield was a rebel, as I told you. So he had to give him up to a Catholic school where he took a lot of beatings from the nuns because he was not a very obedient child. So basically, in 1908, he studied at the Royal Bavarian Arts, and he was a very talented designer right from the beginning. He took this name, as I told you, because during the First World War, Berlin street crowds commonly shouted, "May God punish England." So contrary to what the people were saying, he said, well, I'm going to take this name from now on. In 1917, he became a member of the Dadaist movement. He was also, what is interesting is that he was dismissed and he was marginalized because he supported the strike that followed the assassination of strikers and the political activist Karl Liebenknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. They were Spartakists. They were organizing a radical leftist coup and protest and strike. And Friedrich Ebert was in power, so to speak, milder social democrat that repressed and ordered a crackdown on the revolt, and these two were killed. Now, in 1924, he met Bertolt Brecht. He is one of the most and well-known theater practitioner, playwright, poet, He basically is famous for his playwrights, and he was immersed in the Marxist thought. He wrote a lot of important theater plays, and his career was important and very prolific. What is interesting is that the two became friends in 1924, and for a number of years, it was John Heartfield that created the theater sets for the plays Bertolt Brecht directed. Now, he used, as Hannah Höch, he used a lot of the technique of photomontage. He used it because he thought that it should be used as an instrument of class struggle. He thought that um, advertising is an immoral way to earn a living, so this is very much contrary to what my students might think, because they came to a department where they teach how to make important designs for companies in order to earn money. He considered that now that everybody has access to printing and information, that must be an instrument for democracy. And he used this technique of photomontage, and he was an ardent critic of National Socialism. It is not like the Nazis didn't came for him. The history recorded an episode where he had to flee by jumping through the balcony and hiding into a trash bin from the Gestapo coming to arrest him. Now, I want to show you here just one of his posters where he mocked, the Nazi Germany and National Socialism. It was Minister Hermann Göring said that iron makes the country strong and butter makes people fat and lazy. And as you see here, you basically have this image where
You know
you
what I'm
have
laughing? You know why I'm laughing? Have you seen a picture of Göring?
why he's very fat.
Yeah, exactly.
So he was probably eating a lot of the butter that the Germans lacked. I mean, you see here that you have this wallpaper with the swastikas, and they are eating up the whole family. They have the picture of the Führer in their room and probably in their kitchen, and they are eating a bicycle. And even the dog chews on an iron because they want to be strong and not lazy. Now, another important poster he published basically in two important, very important newspapers. One of them, Arbeiter Illustrierte Zeitung, that was a very important newspaper that reached at his peak to 500,000 copies being sold. And this is probably why the Nazis wanted to, get their hands on Heartfield. But basically, he had to flee Nazi Germany as all the others. He fled to Czechoslovakia. But then, of course, he had to flee to London because it was occupied, and just before it was occupied, he had to flee. So basically, he was refused British residency in 1939. So he left for the United States with his family. He had a very complicated life after World War II, unfortunately. He was denied the right to remain in England, and he moved back to East Berlin. And basically, he worked there, but he was interrogated by the Stasi because he lived for a long time in England and now was considered a possible traitor. And he narrowly avoided a trial for treason. He was denied admission into the Academy of Arts in Eastern Germany. He was prohibited to work as an artist. And it was only at the intervention of his good friend Bertolt Brecht that he was admitted finally in 1956 in the Academy of Arts. So basically, he produces photo montages on nuclear war, but he was not as prolific as he was when he was young. Now, that was another sad story. What we have here in this poster, as we can see, we have the image of Hitler that receives. And I want you to think of something, because you see, this is so sad, and I will tell you why. You have this poster by John Heartfield saying a little man that asks for big gifts. The documentaries, the history, the movies, they all concentrate on Hitler and his seducing power and his rhetorical skills, and not so much on the financial support that he received. When you look at the documentaries, when you discuss World War II and especially Germany, you see this image of this very powerful man that seduces the masses. And it's all like the evil is all concentrated around Hitler, while in fact he was not alone and he got a lot of support.
Of course. Actually, 60%, he gets 60% of support of the German people. That is a lot.
But he gets this financial support also,
of course.
because...
Well, he get the financial support because he was, adopting, Jewish-owned businesses. It was nationalization. And actually, it was, it is very complicated because, the beginning of the Second World War is also linked to the USSR then because of the, this contract by Ribbentrop and Molotov. And actually, the Russians are one that produced first German tanks because Germany, due to the Versailles, I forgot the English term, agreement, was forbidden to have army and forbidden to have any, military techniques, military technology. But anyway, they did skip that, and they did it in the USSR. And it was very complicated. And actually, they were creating oil from coal, back in the Second World War. It was extremely, something extremely complicated. But you're right that, they were never concentrated on the financial side. So,
that would be very interesting to have this type of political economy, to have just as many documentaries focusing on who supported financially Hitler, because we have many psychotic, individuals. So it was not by accident that this particular psychotic individual got into power. He was not alone. He was not acting alone. And all these documentaries create this aura of an extraordinary, man that was able all by himself to seduce the whole Germany, while in fact, as you so cleverly pointed out, he was not at all alone. So there were specific conditions.
Let me say one thing, but every dictator serves a purpose. And behind such a powerful, because, it's an extreme cost. It's extremely expensive to have a person like that. And he needs a huge, support. So remember that behind the dictator, always a puppeteer. So this is the history. This is there are millions of of theories that are like that there is somebody behind Hitler, and of course I would agree with that because it is a fact that he was actually he was using drugs. His doctor was giving him drugs, and actually this orator speech talent was, empowered with drugs.
I want to reach right now to something that is not so politically loaded on the surface. Now, France, what I love about France is that they were the first to acknowledge that nation branding is important. You know, they were the first to invest in the Royal Academy. They were the first to invest in arts and literature, but with a higher purpose, you know. They didn't invest in these things and these areas just like that because they were very refined. On the contrary, they were very, very smart. So it was Cardinal Richelieu, basically, who lived from 1585 to 1642, so a long time ago, that first started to invest in the French Academy, into writers, into building the so-called official and literary French language. Why? Because he wanted to brand, we would say today, but he wanted to impose the image of his country, France, being the center, you know, of culture, literature, arts, you know, refined tastes. So you might have think that this is, you know, by accident, while in fact it was a very clever, you know, political move to invest in his in this particular field and to support French intellectuals in order to create this aura, you know, to create this symbolic capital. And this is why France was pretty much aware of the fact that they have to put themselves on the map of design. And they were unsuccessful due to the fact that they were hardly hit by World War I, and they were not really successful in military terms, so to speak, and in wars they were not quite successful. On the contrary, but in 1925 they managed to put themselves on the map because they finally had this exhibition of decorative and modern industrial arts in Paris that basically gathered some of the most talented designers, and it was so important that it gave the name of current that we talked briefly on our last presentation, that is called Art Deco, that had a very prolific life, not only in France, but especially in the United States, well, where it was mainly used for the architectural design of movie theaters. And you see here that it is characterized by this very luxurious and at the same time simple design. And it is a combination between curves and abstract lines, and they put themselves on the map, you know, with this style. So they basically managed to impose, you know, French design and French design school as a important artistic current during that time. Now, also in Italy, because they had, Antonio Boggeri was able to create in Milan a very important school of design. And he was free to experiment with modernist ideas. He was free to do all sorts of things because basically Mussolini supported. And basically futurism in Italy became like the standard form of art due to this close connection between Marinetti and Mussolini. So he basically, this movement and Studio Boggeri that he created in Milan was also putting Milan on the map of international design. And now Karl Teige, another very sad, so to speak, not very sad, but it is so interesting to see how these historical events influenced a great deal the life of designers. And while for somebody like Kurt Schwitters, it was quite dramatic, because he had to flee Germany, he was not accepted in England, he had to rely on some sort of the mercy of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He saw some of his, beautiful architectural designs being destroyed, and he basically died fighting to restore that. And now we have here a designer from Czechoslovakia, a communist, Karel Teige, was his name. Thank you very much for pointing that out. I am trying not to destroy their names. Now, what is interesting that in 1918, just like Romania, Czechoslovakia was formed, and it was a wave of optimism. And he was an avant-garde architect, and he was internationally famous. But why? Because unlike other artists from small countries, he had close connections to very important he was very close to André Breton, that is the founder of surrealism, and he invited him to Prague. He was also friend with Le Corbusier or Vladimir Mayakovsky or Walter Gropius, that founded the Bauhaus, and he invited them to lecture in Prague. Now, and he was translating and interpreting their lectures for the audience in Prague. And this is why he was also able, to put himself on the map of international design and to become well known. Now, why do I say it is sad? Because even though he welcomed the Soviet armies as liberator, Teige was silenced by the communist government in 1948. So in 1951, he died in Prague due to a heart attack. He only lived 51 years. And it was said, the history says that he died because he was very upset due to a very vicious press campaign against him, where they labeled him as a Trotskyist degenerate. And his papers were destroyed by the secret police, and his work was suppressed for decades. So kind of controversial and sad story at the same time. Now, he created, because he was this publishing book in Czechoslovakia, Odeon was releasing this magazine that was called Red. And here I put one of the designs of the cover of this magazine, of one of the numbers of this magazine that was issued by Odeon publishing house. And as you see, he used sans serif fonts. He was very forward thinking and abstract, design. What do you think? A rather sad story, isn't it?
Yeah, actually, I can understand what is written there
Oh,
because
please tell us.
Czech language is very similar to Polish language, and of course, it means 10 years of Soviet cultural works between 1970 and 1927, and it costs 6 Czech crowns.
Thanks for making this clear to us, Frank.
Yes.
Now, here we have a more pragmatic, personality of Ladislav Sutnar, who was not so politically involved. He made basically the transition from European modernism to commercial communication in North America using the principle of modernism, but not to, make some political and to amplify political messages, but to sell consumer goods. And he wrote three important books: Controlled Visual Flow, Shape, Line, Color, Package Design, the Forest of Visual Selling, visual design in action, principle and purpose. So he was a pragmatic, and that was very good for him because unlike Karel Teige, that was basically, the victim of a very vicious attack from the press and from political factors, he was living a very quite nice life in the United States selling consumer goods. Now, as I often explained, and you told me that it is very interesting how things evolved in, socialist realism. And national identity is very important during that time. I mean, how do you build your national identity? Basically, socialist realism come to replace constructivism in design. And we have here just a poster. I think you have many examples. And I remember when I was little that we had this type of representations all over the place in schools, kindergartens, public squares, buildings all over the place. Now, I often tell my students, and they are quite appalled by the idea that this is progress in a way. Why? Because it is the first time that you see peasants and workers working together. It is the first time that you see the woman as a hero of the working class, and not only as a mother or a virgin martyr or a decadent, seductress or adulteress or stuff like that. So she's represented by what she does in the public sphere, not by what she does in the private sphere. So this is in a way progress. I don't know what you think, but I think it's some sort of
Yeah,
progress. Of
of
course,
course
if
it
you
is.
look at it, just a moment, I will give you right away the chance to tell you your impression. You see here that you have a worker that has shoes, and she doesn't have shoes. Okay, she is barefooted, and she's probably a peasant. So they were progressive, but not quite. What do you think?
Well, about the food, I will start there because about the bare foods, feet. I mean, sorry, about the bare feet. I mean, this is. I accept. I mean, I look at that as some kind of glorification because it means purity for me. At least I see that for me in that light. And worker needs his shoes because he's making, he's working with steel, with materials that can, easily can, injure him. But what is most important thing here is that on this, in this archetype of, in this on this, because this is not only one. If you remember Moss film, the monument of Moss film that is shown as by a worker and I think also a peasant woman. I have to check. Does she have shoes there? Um, yeah, which are also very similar actually, vision. But the most important thing is that woman here is equal to men. They have the same place on this presentation. So this is the main, I think,
Yes, and it is the
goal of
first
the
thing that
socialist.
she's presented through her work, okay?
Yes,
And what
exactly.
she does in the public sphere, not by what she does in the bedroom, okay? So
Yeah.
she is
No, no, no. But
decentralized, so
bare
to
feet. I
speak.
think for me it's a glorification that means something pure. Like
Yes,
when you
but
walk bare.
I was just
Jesus walked.
listening.
Jesus walked bare feet, barefoot. Also,
Well,
when he was
well,
wearing
I
his
would not
cross.
have this,
But
reference
people were
here.
believers in the smaller villages. People were believers. I think this is a mind continuation of the vision that you
It
preserve.
is
What do you
probably,
see?
I don't think so. I think, and I take issue with the idea of purity related to women. I was just listening to one of the main anti-pornography activists, and one of the men in the room asked her a very important question. And he said, we live in a culture where purity is attached to women, and this is why it's so useful and tempting to degrade and depurify women. So basically we have to deconstruct this whole idea of purity related to women, because it leads to very interesting things
I
that I
don't
would
think
not like.
I would not agree with that, because if you want to combine, if you want to advert something like this lifestyle, because this is a picture of a lifestyle, right? And you have this people back then in the realities back then, in the middle years of the 20th century, when the communism was something new on these lands, and it was a vast land, which was, from Europe to the end of Asia, and people there was before that in another epoch. They were actually in another even system, because they're in feudal system, which was, and strongly Christianized, system. And this is a woman which is pure. She's almost like, this mother of God, and that's for maybe
I
the,
think
I
she's
think yes.
represented. I would like to believe that this is not the,
I think
the
there's the Christian
connotation that
connection,
they
but this
have
is
in mind.
my observation, of course. Yes.
Now, my next presentation will be about modernism and how it came to be associated with the United States, and how, you see, we had this wonderful, history of modernism in Europe, where it was mainly a political, um, a political message, as a political, and using design as a political tool, while in the United States it became only a form, and they only used the form for different purposes, to sell consumer goods. Or in this case, what is very interesting, it was used by Roosevelt to promote his New Deal policies, in this case the electrification campaign that he had. And he hired a very important designer that I'm going to discuss next time, Lester Beale, to create this simple, powerful, posters in order to promote that. And of course, we have here, first of all, you see, these are exactly the characters that Germans believe that should be used, not the sans serif fonts, but these ones that were deemed to be respectable and German and authentic and so on, and not degenerate, of course. And you see how absurd this is. How would you think that something like this that I showed at the beginning, is degenerate? So this is the definition by the Nazis of degenerate art, while this that I'm showing now, it is the definition of authentic art. And this is the last one, I think this one result was the Zozo poster, that you
Yeah.
had.
Very similar, to be honest. Very
Very
similar.
similar, isn't it, to the Zozo
Yeah.
posters that we discussed? And this is basically it, a very short presentation on what happened in the interwar period and during World War II. I hope you find it interesting, and that I hope our viewers find it interesting, and mostly my students and other people that are interested in the history of design. So thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you.